In the winter of 1876, deep in the isolated mountains of Montana Territory, a German doctor named Theodor Brennan made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside a remote cabin 23 miles from the nearest settlement, he found medical records that documented 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding within a single Irish family. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Hidden beneath the floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth, were the preserved remains of 7 infants, all bearing identical deformities that marked them as unworthy of life according to their own parents. The Donnelly family had been practicing selective infanticide for over a century, eliminating any child born with visible genetic defects to maintain their carefully constructed facade of normality. What Dr. Brennan discovered next would challenge everything the medical community believed about heredity, family bonds, and the lengths people would go to protect their bloodline's dark secrets. The evidence he uncovered suggested that this wasn't an isolated case of frontier madness, but part of a deliberate genetic experiment that had been refined and perfected across generations, spanning 2 continents and nearly 100 years of carefully concealed family practices. The story Dr. Brennan would later document in his private journals began not in Montana's unforgiving wilderness, but in the rolling green hills of County Cork, Ireland, where the Donnelly bloodline first took its twisted turn toward genetic catastrophe during the harsh winter of 1798. Back then, Ireland was a land scarred by centuries of British rule, where famine loomed like a constant shadow, and rural families clung to ancient traditions mixed with emerging ideas from the Enlightenment. Fergus Donnelly, the patriarch who started it all, was no ordinary peasant farmer. Born in 1765 to a family of minor landowners who had managed to hold on to a modest plot despite the penal laws that stripped Catholics of their rights, Fergus had received a rudimentary education from a hedge schoolmaster who smuggled forbidden books on natural philosophy and agriculture. These texts opened his eyes to the revolutionary concepts of selective breeding, inspired by the work of English agriculturists like Robert Bakewell, who had transformed sheep and cattle through careful mating to produce stronger, more productive animals. Fergus became obsessed with the idea that humans too could be improved in the same way. He saw the Irish people as weakened by generations of poverty, intermarriage with inferior stocks, and the oppression of foreign rulers. In his mind, the Donnelly family could become the seed of a renewed, superior Irish race, taller, smarter, more resilient, if only they controlled their bloodline with the precision of a master breeder. He began by arranging marriages within his own extended family, pairing his children with first cousins, justifying it through selective readings of the Bible, where patriarchs like Abraham married close kin without divine reproach. The first unions produced children who seemed to validate his theories: pale blue eyes that pierced like ice, sharp angular features that gave them an almost ethereal beauty, and a quick wit that set them apart from their neighbors. But not all were perfect. In 1798, amid the chaos of the Irish Rebellion, when United Irishmen rose against British rule and County Cork echoed with the cries of battle, Fergus's daughter-in-law gave birth to a child with a cleft palate and twisted limbs. The infant's cries were weak, its survival unlikely in those hard times. Fergus declared it a sign of impurity, a contamination that must be purged to protect the line. Under the cover of a stormy night, the child was released from suffering, as the family journals would later euphemize it, smothered quietly and buried in an unmarked grave beneath an ancient oak tree on their farm. This act set the precedent, a dark ritual passed down like a sacred duty. As the generations unfolded, the practice evolved. Fergus's son Liam expanded the records, keeping meticulous notes in leather-bound books hidden in the thatched roof of their cottage. He documented each birth, each deformity, each merciful release. By the 1820s, as the potato crop began showing early signs of blight and rural Ireland teetered on the edge of disaster, the Donnellys had refined their criteria. Desirable traits included not just physical uniformity, but also intellectual prowess. Children who could recite long passages from memory or solve complex riddles were spared and groomed for leadership within the family. Undesirables, those with clubbed feet, extra fingers, or even unusual temperaments deemed unstable, were eliminated swiftly, often within hours of birth, to avoid emotional attachment. The family justified this through a blend of folk Catholicism and pseudoscience, claiming God had entrusted them with the stewardship of their blood, much like Noah preserving the pure lions on the ark. They moved frequently within County Cork, from one remote farmstead to another, to evade the prying eyes of priests and neighbors who might notice the suspiciously high rate of stillbirths. By the time of the Great Famine in the 1840s, when millions starved or fled Ireland, the Donnellys had concentrated their gene pool even further. Patrick's grandfather, Sean, married his own niece, producing offspring with intensified traits: the signature pale eyes, now almost luminous, fingers elongated like those of a pianist, and a resilience that allowed them to survive the famine better than most, hoarding food with ruthless efficiency. But the deformities increased: spina bifida, hydrocephalus, congenital heart defects. The journals from this era are stained with desperation. Entries written by candlelight describing infants with fused limbs or absent eyes, all returned to God before they could weaken the line. Sean documented 20 such cases over his lifetime, each with anatomical sketches drawn from memory, as dissection was too risky. The family developed codes. The weak lamb was taken by the wolf meant infanticide by exposure. The angel called early indicated smothering. As immigration waves swept Ireland, the Donnellys debated fleeing to America, where vast lands promised isolation, but they stayed until 1874, when a scandal forced their hand. Father Michael O'Sullivan, the parish priest in their latest village, a man known for his compassion toward starving families, stumbled upon the truth during a house blessing. He found a hidden compartment in the Donnelly home containing a small wooden box with preserved fetal remains, tiny skeletons with deformities, kept as reminders of the cost of purity. Horrified, he confronted Patrick, who had inherited the mantle as family patriarch. Patrick, educated in secret by his father on the science of heredity, argued it was mercy, not murder, citing emerging ideas from Charles Darwin's works, which had filtered into Ireland through smuggled books. But O'Sullivan saw it as diabolical, threatening excommunication and exposure to the authorities. "What you have done in the name of bloodline purity is a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance," he wrote in a trembling hand. "Leave this parish immediately, or I will ensure that every soul in County Cork knows the true nature of your family's abominations." The Donnellys fled that night, selling their farm for gold coins, accumulated over generations through shrewd dealings, and boarding a ship to America with forged papers claiming Brooklyn residency. They carried their journals, the preserved remains for study, and a determination to continue the experiment in the New World. The Montana Territory of 1874 represented the very edge of American civilization, a land where federal authority existed more in theory than practice. Helena, the territorial capital, boasted barely 8,000 souls, clustered around the mining operations that had sparked the region's growth, with placer gold discoveries in Last Chance Gulch drawing fortune seekers from across the nation. The surrounding mountains held only scattered mining camps, isolated homesteads, and native tribes like the Blackfeet and Crow, still actively resisting the encroachment of white settlers through skirmishes and raids. It was a landscape carved by violence and shaped by desperation, where families could disappear for months without anyone asking questions, where the harsh winters claimed lives regularly, with temperatures plunging to 40 below zero, and where the territorial government's reach extended only as far as its scattered deputies could ride through treacherous mountain passes, blanketed in snowdrifts taller than a man on horseback. The gold rush that had initially drawn settlers to Montana was beginning to wane by 1874, leaving behind abandoned claims riddled with empty shafts and desperate men willing to try anything for survival, from trapping beaver to rustling cattle. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of wilderness, making even basic necessities like flour and salt scarce and expensive, often arriving via mule trains that braved Indian attacks and avalanches. Medical care was virtually non-existent outside Helena, and even there it consisted mainly of Army surgeons at Fort Shaw and self-taught frontier doctors, whose knowledge was limited to treating gunshot wounds from saloon brawls, setting broken bones from mining accidents, and dosing laudanum for the ague. Whiskey served as both anesthetic and antiseptic, and amputations were common for infections that modern medicine would cure with ease. It was precisely this isolation and lack of oversight that made Montana Territory attractive to certain types of settlers, those who needed to disappear from civilized society and its inconvenient questions, like outlaws evading bounties or families hiding scandals. Into this unforgiving landscape came Patrick Donnelly and his wife Bridget, along with their 4 surviving children. Seamus, age 19, a strapping young man with the family's signature angular jaw but a growing stutter that betrayed inner turmoil. Moira, 17, whose pale eyes held a wisdom far beyond her years, shadowed by unspoken burdens. Colleen, 15, small and watchful, with fingers that twisted unnaturally at the joints, and young Declan, barely 12, whose spine already showed the faint. They arrived in Helena on a freight wagon in September 1874, dust-caked from the long journey across the plains, their possessions carefully packed in wooden crates reinforced with iron bands, suggesting wealth unusual for typical Irish immigrants, who often arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Patrick presented himself as a successful potato farmer, fleeing the lingering effects of the Irish famine, though the Great Hunger had ended over 2 decades earlier. But his hands showed none of the calluses typical of agricultural work, smooth and ink-stained from years of journaling rather than tilling soil. Instead, his fingers bore the marks of a man accustomed to record-keeping, and his speech carried the educated accent of someone who had received formal schooling in hidden Irish academies, rare luxuries for a Catholic peasant under British rule. Bridget Donnelly struck observers as a woman perpetually on the edge of nervous collapse, small-boned and prematurely aged, her skin sallow from years of indoor confinement during pregnancies, her hair streaked with gray that she hid under a shawl. She rarely spoke above a whisper, her voice cracking like dry leaves, and kept her children close with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her hands clutching their sleeves as if fearing they might vanish into the Montana winds. Local merchants in Helena noted that she paid for supplies exclusively in gold coins, counting each one multiple times before reluctantly parting with it, her eyes darting around as if expecting theft or judgment. Those eyes held a haunted quality that suggested she had witnessed horrors that went far beyond the typical hardships of frontier life, shipwrecks on the Atlantic crossing, cholera outbreaks in steerage, or the screams of dying infants in famine-stricken cottages. What the Territorial Land Office didn't know was that the Donnellys carried elaborately falsified papers from New York, claiming residency in Brooklyn for 3 years prior to their westward journey. Documents expertly forged by a shady scribe in Cork, with fake employment records from a non-existent textile mill, and fabricated references from imaginary priests. In reality, they had never lived in New York. They had fled directly from Ireland after the scandal with Father O'Sullivan, sailing on the SS Britannic with hundreds of other immigrants, but keeping to themselves in a private cabin paid for with hoarded gold. Patrick had purchased 160 acres of remote mountain land from the territorial government under the Homestead Act, paying in gold coins that raised no suspicions in a territory where such currency was common among former miners and prospectors who had struck it rich in the gulches. The land sat in a narrow valley between 2 steep ridges, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that snaked through dense pine forests and over boulder-strewn creeks, becoming completely impassable during the worst winter months, when snow piled up in drifts that could swallow a horse whole. The isolation was so complete that smoke from their cabin chimney couldn't be seen from any neighboring homestead, the nearest being a trapper's shack 15 miles away, and the only water source was a spring-fed creek that flowed briskly during the brief summer months before freezing solid for nearly half the year, forcing residents to melt snow for drinking. The location was perfect for a family that desperately needed to hide from the world, but it also presented challenges that would test even their carefully planned survival strategies: avalanches that could bury the cabin, grizzly bears raiding livestock, and wolves howling through the nights, drawn by the scent of blood from births or burials. The growing season at that altitude lasted barely 4 months, requiring intensive agricultural knowledge to produce enough potatoes, turnips, and hardy grains for winter survival, with soil so rocky that every furrow had to be cleared by hand. The extreme cold could kill livestock in a single night if proper precautions weren't taken. Barns insulated with sod and hay, animals blanketed against the wind. And the psychological pressure of complete isolation for 6 months of every year had driven many frontier families to madness or suicide, cabins becoming tombs for those who cracked under the endless white silence. Yet the Donnellys built their homestead with the efficiency of people who had faced similar challenges before, drawing on generations of rural Irish ingenuity honed in the bogs and hills of Cork. Patrick and his sons constructed a sturdy log cabin with thick walls designed to retain heat, chinked with mud and moss to seal out drafts, small windows that minimized heat loss but allowed just enough light for reading the journals by day, and a complex system of interior partitions that could be sealed off during the coldest weather to conserve warmth in a single room. The construction showed knowledge of building techniques that went beyond typical frontier skills, incorporating Norwegian-style dovetail notches, learned from books and sloped roofs to shed snow, suggesting either previous experience with extreme climates or consultation with experts before their arrival in Montana. Perhaps Scandinavian immigrants in Cork harbors who shared tales of Arctic winters. Bridget and the girls prepared for their first Montana winter with methodical precision that impressed even experienced mountain dwellers they encountered in Helena. They preserved meat using techniques passed down from famine times, salting venison in barrels, smoking fish over alderwood fires, drying berries into leathery strips for scurvy prevention, and cultivated crops specifically chosen for their ability to grow in short seasons in poor soil, like frost-resistant cabbage and oats bred for high altitudes. They established systems for rationing supplies that showed mathematical precision, unusual for supposedly uneducated Irish peasants, calculating daily caloric needs with charts drawn from Patrick's memory of agricultural treatises. But neighbors who occasionally encountered them during supply runs to Helena noted peculiarities that set the Donnellys apart from other frontier families. The family members bore striking resemblances to one another that went far beyond normal family traits. Their pale blue eyes like chips of glacier ice, sharp angular features that made their faces seem carved from marble, and unusually long fingers that moved with an eerie grace, as if designed for intricate tasks like surgery or piano playing. The children displayed behavioral patterns that seemed simultaneously advanced and disturbing. Remarkable intelligence and self-discipline for their ages, reciting poetry or solving arithmetic problems with ease, but also a wariness around strangers, and a submissiveness to parental authority that suggested fear rather than respect, their eyes flicking to Patrick for approval before speaking a word. Most unsettling were the conversations overheard by Jake Harrison, the territorial mail carrier who made monthly runs through the mountain settlements on his sturdy mule, braving blizzards and rock slides to deliver letters and parcels. The family spoke frequently in Irish Gaelic, a lilting tongue that sounded like wind through reeds to outsiders. But even when using English, their discussions contained references to maintaining the purity of the line, the strength that comes from proper breeding, and the sacrifices necessary for family advancement. These weren't the typical concerns of frontier families struggling for basic survival, worries about crop yields or Indian raids, but suggested deeper, more disturbing motivations for their isolated lifestyle, hints of a philosophy that viewed humans as improvable stock. Harrison, a grizzled veteran of the Civil War with a limp from Gettysburg, found their uniformity unnerving, like looking at reflections in a distorted mirror. The first sign that something was deeply wrong with the Donnelly family emerged in March 1875, when the spring thaw finally opened the mountain passes after 6 months of complete isolation, melting snow revealing swollen creeks and mud-choked trails. Jake Harrison, making his first mail run since the previous October, arrived at their cabin to deliver government correspondence, homestead updates, and census forms, and immediately sensed that something terrible had happened during the long winter months, the air thick with unspoken dread. The cabin itself showed signs of recent alterations, new boards nailed over what appeared to be holes in the walls, perhaps from fists or tools in rage, fresh chinking-filled gaps that suggested violence or struggle, mud smeared hastily, and the area around the building bore evidence of significant digging despite the frozen ground, earth turned in irregular patches, as if burying something in haste. Most disturbing was the smell that permeated the entire homestead, a sickly sweet odor that Harrison recognized from his years of frontier experience as the lingering scent of death and decay, not the clean rot of animals but something more intimate, more human. Bridget Donnelly met him at the door, her appearance so dramatically changed that Harrison initially didn't recognize her, mistaking her for an older relative. The woman who had arrived in Montana just 6 months earlier as a nervous but relatively healthy frontier wife now looked haggard and hollow-eyed, her cheeks sunken like a famine victim's, her hands trembling with what appeared to be chronic anxiety or perhaps the onset of palsy. Her clothing hung loose on a frame that had lost significant weight, bones protruding at wrists and collar, and her hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples, strands escaping her bun like spider webs. When she attempted to speak, her voice cracked as if she hadn't used it in weeks, dry and rasping. The winter was difficult, she managed to whisper, glancing nervously toward the cabin's interior where shadows moved. We lost. We had complications. Harrison, pushing past his unease, found the family in the midst of what appeared to be a difficult birth, with Bridget in active labor, attended only by her teenage daughter Moira, who knelt with bloody hands in a basin of water heated over the wood stove. But what he witnessed during that March afternoon would later become crucial evidence in understanding the family's dark history. The scene was orchestrated with a clinical precision that suggested extensive previous experience with similar situations. Tools laid out on a clean cloth, scissors, twine, herbal poultices brewed from willow bark for pain, more like a surgeon's kit than a homespun birthing. The infant that emerged was clearly malformed, its spine curved in an unnatural S-shape, twisting the tiny body into a painful arc, its left arm ending in a clubbed hand with only 3 fused fingers, and its head disproportionately large with a pronounced sloping forehead that indicated severe developmental abnormalities, perhaps hydrocephalus swelling the skull. The child's breathing was labored, rattling in its chest like wind through a cracked pipe, and its cries had a weak, mewling quality that suggested internal complications beyond the visible deformities, maybe a heart defect or lung malformation. But what disturbed Harrison most was the family's reaction to this obviously suffering infant. Rather than the grief, concern, or frantic efforts to help that he expected from parents facing such a tragedy, prayers to saints, desperate warming by the fire, they observed what he later described as cold, calculated assessment in their eyes, like ranchers evaluating a lame calf for slaughter. Patrick and Bridget exchanged meaningful glances while speaking to each other in rapid Irish Gaelic that Harrison couldn't understand, their tone suggesting not surprise or anguish, but rather discussion of predetermined procedures for handling a familiar situation, words clipped and efficient. "The child won't survive the week," Patrick announced with clinical detachment, his voice steady as if reading from a ledger, though the infant's breathing appeared relatively strong despite the labor, and its cries, while weak, suggested basic vitality, pink skin flushing with effort. "The mountain air is too harsh for one so delicate. It's God's mercy, really. Better to take them young than let them suffer a life of pain and burden." Harrison, his war-hardened stomach turning, offered to ride immediately to Helena for a doctor, emphasizing that even severely deformed infants sometimes survived with proper medical care. Wrapping for warmth, goat's milk feeds, perhaps a surgeon's intervention for the spine. But Patrick firmly refused, his pale blue eyes growing hard with an authority that brooked no argument, his hand clenching the doorframe. "We know how to handle our own troubles," he said, placing a possessive hand on his wife's shoulder, fingers digging in slightly. "It's the Lord's will that some children aren't meant for this world. Interfering with divine judgment would be a sin against nature itself." The religious justification struck Harrison as rehearsed, as if Patrick had delivered similar explanations many times before, his cadence like a priest's sermon but laced with threat. There was also an underlying menace in his tone that suggested serious consequences for anyone who might interfere with the family's private handling of the situation. A subtle shift in posture that recalled Harrison's encounters with desperate outlaws. Seamus and young Declan, who had been working outside during the birth, chopping wood for the endless fire, returned to the cabin with expressions that showed no surprise at finding their mother in labor or their newest sibling obviously deformed, suggesting this wasn't the first such birth they had witnessed, their faces blank as if schooled in stoicism. Seamus nodded curtly, avoiding the infant's gaze, while Declan stared with wide eyes before looking away. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later with routine mail delivery, a catalog from Sears Roebuck, territorial news pamphlets, the infant was gone, the cabin air still heavy with that sweet decay. Bridget met him at the door with red-rimmed but completely dry eyes, the look of someone who had exhausted their capacity for grief rather than experiencing fresh loss, her posture slumped like a willow in wind. "Lost a baby 3 days after you left," she reported in a voice devoid of emotion, flat as the prairie. "Buried him behind the cabin next to the others. The weak don't survive out here, and it's better that way. Spares them the suffering." Her phrase, "next to the others," sent chills through Harrison's spine, a casual admission that implied routine. Behind the cabin, he now noticed for the first time a row of small wooden crosses marking fresh-turned earth, stakes hammered into the rocky soil, with dates carved crudely: October 1874, November 1874, January 1875, March 1875. He counted 4 graves, all too small for adult burials, the dirt mounded in low heaps that would settle with rain. The implications were staggering. The Donnellys had lost multiple infants during their first year in Montana, losses that had never been reported to territorial authorities as required by law for census and health records. The graves themselves looked wrong to Harrison's experienced eye, the dirt disturbed in a pattern that suggested hasty, panicked work rather than the careful burial of beloved children, clods scattered as if dug at night. The crosses uniform in size and construction, as if made in advance from a single plank, not whittled with love, and the spacing between graves suggested systematic planning rather than random tragedy, aligned in a grid that left space for additional burials, like plots in a garden awaiting seeds. That summer, as Harrison continued his monthly mail runs through blooming meadows alive with wildflowers and buzzing insects, he began paying careful attention to the Donnelly family dynamics, noting details in his own mental ledger, born of suspicion. What he observed gradually painted a picture of a household operating under rules and pressures that had nothing to do with typical frontier survival. Not just hunting game or storing wood, but something internal, corrosive. The children moved with the careful precision of people who knew that mistakes carried severe consequences, steps measured, voices lowered. Their interactions with each other showed patterns of communication that suggested shared knowledge of family secrets too dangerous to discuss openly. Glances exchanged like coded signals. Moira and Colleen, despite being only 17 and 15, carried themselves with the knowledge and weariness of much older women who had seen childbirth and death up close. They handled domestic tasks with efficiency that went beyond normal teenage competence, skinning rabbits without flinching, brewing tonics from foraged herbs, but their eyes held a haunted quality that suggested they had witnessed things that fundamentally changed their understanding of family relationships, shadows under their lashes like bruises. When they spoke to their parents, their voices carried a deference rooted in fear rather than respect, words chosen carefully as if one slip could bring punishment. Seamus, the eldest son at 19, had developed a pronounced stutter that seemed to worsen whenever his father was present, words catching in his throat like fishbones. He flinched at sudden movements, the crack of a branch or slam of a door, and avoided eye contact with anyone outside the immediate family, staring at the ground. Most disturbing was his reaction to questions about family life. He would begin to respond normally. The winter was hard, then catch himself and fall silent, as if remembering consequences for revealing family information, his face paling. Young Declan appeared the most normal of the children, with a boy's curiosity about the wildlife, pointing out elk tracks, but Harrison caught him once staring at the small cemetery behind the cabin with an expression of terror rather than sadness, his small hands clenched. When asked about his deceased siblings, the boy had responded haltingly. "Sometimes babies aren't right, and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes I think maybe God didn't decide." The child had immediately clapped his hand over his mouth as if realizing he had said something forbidden, eyes widening in panic, and refused to speak another word during Harrison's entire visit, retreating to the shadows. Most disturbing were the conversations Harrison sometimes overheard when approaching the cabin quietly through the forest, his mule's hooves muffled by pine needles. The family spoke frequently about keeping the line pure, maintaining the strength of the blood, and the sacrifices our ancestors made to preserve what matters. Phrases that echoed like incantations. They used Irish phrases that Harrison couldn't translate. Fuel, GHLAN, for pure blood, perhaps. But the tone suggested rituals or traditions that went far beyond normal family customs, solemn as a mass. There were references to the others back home, what happened to the weak ones, and, most chillingly, discussions of which children show the signs and how to handle the imperfect ones, voices low and conspiratorial. These conversations painted a picture of a family operating according to beliefs and practices that predated their arrival in Montana by many years, possibly generations, a legacy carried across the ocean like a curse. The isolated mountain homestead wasn't just a refuge from civilization. It was a carefully chosen location where the family could continue traditions that would be impossible to maintain under the scrutiny of normal community life, away from churches, schools, and nosy neighbors. As 1875 progressed into its harsh winter months, the Donnelly family's isolation became complete once again, snow blocking the mountain passes from November through March, cutting them off entirely from the outside world for the second time since their arrival in Montana territory. The cabin, a lone island in a sea of white. But it was during this second period of isolation that the true nature of their genetic legacy began to manifest in ways that would eventually draw the attention of territorial authorities and shock even the frontier's hardened residents. Whispers of strange lights and sounds filtering down to Helena through trappers' tales. Dr. Theodore Brennan, the territorial physician who would later investigate the family, had arrived in Helena in October 1875, carrying with him medical texts and knowledge that represented the cutting edge of hereditary science from Europe. A graduate of the University of Vienna with additional training in Berlin and Edinburgh, Brennan had studied under physicians like Rudolf Virchow and Joseph Lister, who were just beginning to understand the mechanisms of genetic inheritance through cellular pathology and early microscopy. His medical library contained works by Francis Galton on heredity in twins and Gregor Mendel's pea plant experiments, though Mendel's work was still obscure, giving him knowledge that wouldn't become common medical understanding for decades to come. Ideas about dominant and recessive traits, the dangers of consanguinity. Brennan had come to Montana Territory not for adventure or profit, but to escape a professional scandal in Europe. His research into hereditary traits had led him to conclusions about human breeding that his colleagues found disturbing, advocating for controlled reproduction to improve the human species, in papers that echoed eugenic ideas, making him persona non grata in respectable medical circles, labeled a mad scientist by some. The frontier offered him anonymity and the freedom to pursue his scientific interests without institutional oversight, ironically the same freedom that had attracted the Donnelly family for their own disturbing purposes. During the winter of 1875 to 1876, Brennan received his first hint that something was seriously amiss in the mountain valleys when Jake Harrison arrived at his Helena office in February, having risked the dangerous winter trail on snowshoes, his beard crusted with ice. Harrison described phenomena that defied his 8 years of experience in the Montana wilderness. Strange lights seen coming from the Donnelly cabin at odd hours of the night, flickering like lanterns but with an unnatural blue tint, perhaps from chemical experiments. Smoke patterns that suggested fires being burned at unusual times and temperatures, acrid and lingering, not the clean burn of pine, and most disturbing of all, sounds that carried across the frozen landscape during the still winter nights, echoes amplified by the cold air. "Doctor," Harrison said, his weathered face creased with worry and confusion, stamping snow from his boots, "I've been carrying mail through these mountains for 8 years. I know the difference between normal frontier hardship and something genuinely wrong. What I'm hearing from that cabin in the dead of winter, it's not the sound of people dealing with ordinary troubles. There's crying that goes on for hours, then stops, so suddenly it's like someone threw a switch. And there's singing, if you can call it that doesn't sound quite human. The melody is wrong, like it's meant for voices that don't work the same way ours do. High and keening, like banshees from old tales." Harrison also reported visual phenomena that troubled his practical frontier sensibilities. The Donnelly cabin showed lights burning at times when fuel conservation should have been critical for winter survival. Oil lamps or candles wasting precious resources. The patterns of illumination suggested activities requiring sustained light during the darkest hours of night, activities that didn't match normal family routines like mending or reading, perhaps dissections or rituals. Most disturbing were the occasions when Harrison glimpsed figures moving outside the cabin during blizzard conditions that should have made outdoor activity impossible, figures that seemed unusually tall or moved with gaits that didn't look entirely human in the shifting snow and shadows, elongated limbs swinging awkwardly. Brennan's medical instincts were immediately aroused by Harrison's descriptions, suspecting neurological disorders or hallucinations from cabin fever, but the winter weather made any journey to the Donnelly homestead absolutely impossible. Passes buried under 10 feet of snow. Instead of attempting a dangerous winter journey, Brennan began researching Irish immigration records and territorial archives in Helena's rudimentary library, looking for any available information about the family's background and previous medical history, poring over ship manifests and land deeds by lamplight. What he discovered raised more questions than answers and painted a picture of systematic deception that suggested the family's problems went far deeper than simple frontier hardship. The Donnellys had claimed to be from County Cork, Ireland, fleeing poverty and crop failures that affected rural Irish communities throughout the 1860s and early 1870s. Their stories detailed with tales of blighted fields and evicted tenants, but careful cross-referencing of their claims with official Irish parish records, obtained through correspondence with European contacts, revealed inconsistencies that strongly suggested elaborate falsification. Listed relatives couldn't be verified through church baptismal and marriage records that normally provided reliable genealogical information. Names missing from ledgers. Described farm locations didn't match existing land ownership records from County Cork, plots owned by unrelated families. Most troubling, the stated reasons for immigration, crop failures and poverty, didn't match the significant amount of gold the family had used to purchase their Montana property, pay for transcontinental transportation by stagecoach and rail, and establish their isolated homestead with imported tools. More disturbing were reports Brennan found buried in New York immigration files, requested via telegram to Ellis Island officials. A family named Donnelly had indeed passed through in 1874, but they had been flagged by medical inspectors for concerning physical characteristics among the children that suggested possible genetic abnormalities. Elongated fingers, asymmetrical features, noted in logs as hereditary peculiarities. The medical report described signs of developmental irregularities consistent with hereditary defects, and noted that the parents had become increasingly aggressive and evasive when questioned about their family medical history, Patrick snapping at the examiner. The immigration medical inspector, Dr. Samuel Morrison, had recommended that the family be detained for extended medical evaluation, his notes detailing familial resemblances bordering on the unnatural, but his report had been overruled by administrative officials eager to process the large numbers of immigrants passing through Ellis Island daily, waves of Irish, Germans, and Italians overwhelming the system. Morrison's notes suggested that his concerns went beyond simple medical abnormalities. He had observed behavioral patterns in the family that suggested systematic concealment of information relevant to public health and safety. Children hushed when speaking of home troubles. As Brennan delved deeper into available records, he discovered references to Irish families named Donnelly in other American communities, patterns emerging like threads in a web. A Donnelly family in Pennsylvania had attracted attention from local authorities in 1871 for unusually high infant mortality rates, coroner's inquests noting suspicious circumstances, but closed due to lack of evidence. Another in Ohio had been investigated by county officials in 1873 for possible child neglect. Reports of strange burials on their farm, though the investigation had been dropped when the family suddenly relocated without leaving forwarding information, vanishing into the westward migration. The pattern suggested that the Montana Donnellys weren't isolated criminals, but part of a larger network of related families who shared similar practices and moved frequently to avoid official scrutiny, perhaps branches from the same cork trunk, scattering like seeds. The implications were staggering. If these were all branches of the same extended family, their genetic manipulation and systematic infanticide might have been practiced across multiple states and involved dozens of victims over many years, a hidden epidemic. As spring approached and the mountain passes began to clear with dripping icicles and rushing meltwater, Brennan found himself increasingly obsessed with the mystery of the Donnelly family, his nights filled with dreams of twisted lineages. His professional training told him that isolated populations often develop genetic problems due to limited breeding pools, a well-documented phenomenon in remote communities throughout history, like the royal houses of Europe with their hemophilia and madness. But something about this particular family suggested a pattern far more deliberate and systematic than simple geographic isolation could explain, intentional as a laboratory experiment. The combination of Harrison's disturbing observations, the suspicious immigration records, and the evidence of possible connections to similar families in other states convinced Brennan that the Donnellys represented something unprecedented in his medical experience. A family that had deliberately chosen to pursue genetic experimentation on themselves, regardless of the consequences for their children or the broader community, treating blood as a canvas for perfection. When the spring thaw of 1876 finally opened the mountain trails, wildflowers blooming in profusion, Brennan made the decision to visit the Donnelly homestead personally, ostensibly to provide routine medical services to an isolated frontier family, vaccinations against smallpox, checks for scurvy. What he found there would fundamentally change his understanding of human nature, genetic science, and the lengths to which people would go to preserve family secrets that span multiple generations. The journey to the Donnelly cabin required a full day of difficult travel through terrain that seemed deliberately chosen for its inaccessibility, Brennan's horse picking its way over roots and rocks, the air filled with the scent of pine resin and earth. The trail wound through dense forests where sunlight dappled the ground, across unstable creek beds swollen with runoff, and up steep mountain slopes that would have challenged even experienced horsemen, switchbacks, slick with mud. The isolation was so complete that Brennan encountered no other travelers, no signs of other homesteads, just deer tracks and the distant call of eagles, and no evidence that anyone else had used the trail in months, overgrown with ferns. The cabin itself appeared deceptively normal from the outside, well built with squared logs, well maintained with fresh whitewash on the door, signs of careful farming and successful animal husbandry that suggested a family adapting well to frontier life, a corral with healthy goats, a garden plot tilled for planting. The immediate surroundings showed evidence of hard work and intelligent land use, carefully tended vegetable gardens with rows of beans, climbing stakes, efficient livestock shelters roofed with sod, and water management systems with ditches channeling spring water that demonstrated sophisticated agricultural knowledge, perhaps learned from Irish bog drainage techniques. But Brennan's medically trained eye immediately noticed troubling details that most visitors would have overlooked. Subtle asymmetries in the children's faces as they peered from windows, a faint tremor in Bridget's hands as she waved. The family cemetery behind the cabin contained far too many graves for a family that claimed to have lost only occasional infants to the harsh frontier conditions. Brennan counted 11 wooden crosses, all marking plots that were clearly too small for adult burials, carved with dates that showed deaths occurring at suspiciously regular intervals, every 2 to 3 months, rather than the random clustering typical of epidemic disease like diphtheria or severe weather casualties from blizzards. The graves themselves were arranged in neat rows that suggested systematic planning, rather than desperate responses to unexpected tragedies. Aligned with compass precision, soil compacted evenly. More disturbing was the evidence of recent expansion in the cemetery area, fresh tool marks in the surrounding trees where branches had been cleared for space, and recently moved earth, suggesting that additional grave sites were being prepared in advance. Preparations that implied the family expected future deaths rather than hoping to avoid them through prayer or medicine. The crosses marking existing graves showed similar construction and weathering patterns, as if they had been made in batches from the same lumber rather than individually crafted for each deceased child. No personal touches like flowers or stones. Patrick Donnelly met him at the cabin door with a mixture of frontier hospitality, offering coffee brewed strong, and barely concealed wariness that immediately set Brennan's professional instincts on edge, noting the man's dilated pupils. The family patriarch had aged dramatically since Harrison's descriptions from the previous year. His hair had gone completely white despite his apparent age of 45, stark against his weathered skin. Deep lines creased his face in patterns that suggested chronic stress rather than normal aging, furrows like drought-cracked earth. His hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, a fine vibration that could indicate neurological degeneration, and his eyes held a haunted quality that Brennan recognized from patients suffering from severe psychological trauma, darting as if expecting accusation. "We don't need a doctor here," Patrick said with forced firmness, blocking the threshold, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested, cracking on the last syllable. "We've always handled our own troubles, just as our families did in the old country. Bringing outsiders into family matters only complicates situations that are better resolved through traditional methods, herbs, prayer, the ways of our forebears." Bridget appeared behind her husband, and Brennan was shocked by the extent of her physical deterioration since Harrison's previous descriptions. The woman who had given birth just over a year earlier now looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, her frame so thin that her clothing hung like drapes over protruding bones, ribs visible through fabric. Her hands showed a constant tremor that could have indicated neurological problems, chronic malnutrition despite the family's apparent food stores, or psychological stress severe enough to cause physical symptoms like psychosomatic wasting. When she attempted to speak, a murmur of welcome, Patrick silenced her with a sharp look that suggested years of practiced dominance and consequences for disobedience that went beyond normal marital authority, a glance like a whip. But it was the children who provided the most disturbing evidence of the family's dark secrets and abnormal lifestyle. Moira, now 18, was clearly pregnant again, her belly swelling under her apron, condition advanced enough to suggest conception during the isolated winter months, when no outsiders could have been present. no trappers, no neighbors, raising questions about the father that Brennan found professionally and personally disturbing, implications of incest hovering like smoke. Colleen, now 16, showed signs of premature physical development that seemed accelerated beyond her chronological age. Her adult features appeared fully formed in ways that suggested hormonal abnormalities, possibly related to genetic factors or environmental influences like stress hormones. Breasts and hips developed like a woman's twice her age. More troubling was her behavior around her parents. She displayed a combination of maturity and submissiveness that suggested experiences inappropriate for someone her age, averting eyes when Patrick spoke, body tensing. Most disturbing was young Declan, now 13, who had developed pronounced physical abnormalities since Harrison's previous visits. The boy's facial features showed clear asymmetry, with one side of his face appearing normally developed while the other showed signs of arrested growth or malformation, cheekbone lower, eye drooping. He walked with a pronounced limp that suggested spinal curvature, scoliosis twisting his gait, and his hands showed the elongated fingers and unusual joint flexibility that Brennan recognized as possible indicators of genetic connective tissue disorders. During his brief initial visit, Brennan observed family dynamics that defied normal social conventions and suggested psychological pressures that went far beyond typical frontier hardships. The older children deferred to their parents with a combination of fear and resignation that indicated consequences for disobedience, far more severe than normal parental discipline. No backtalk, no playfulness. Their movements were careful and calculated, as if they had learned through experience that spontaneous behavior could trigger unpredictable and dangerous responses. Seamus spilling a cup and freezing in terror. Seamus, the eldest son at 20, avoided eye contact with both his parents and the visiting doctor, staring at the floorboards. His pronounced stutter had worsened to the point where he could barely communicate, "Why, yes sir," coming out as fragments, and he seemed to be fighting some internal struggle that left him visibly agitated throughout Brennan's visit, sweat beading despite the cool air. When asked direct questions about family life or his own health, Seamus would begin to respond normally, "We farm," and then catch himself mid-sentence and fall silent, as if remembering severe consequences for revealing family information to outsiders, lips pressing white. The family's living arrangements also struck Brennan as abnormal for typical frontier households. The cabin's interior was divided into more separate spaces than necessary for privacy alone, with heavy curtains of wool and locked doors made from imported iron that seemed designed to conceal activities rather than simply organize family life, perhaps birthing rooms or storage for journals. Sounds from other parts of the cabin suggested ongoing activities that the family didn't want their visitor to observe. Rustling papers, muffled whispers, and there were smells. Medicinal like carbolic acid, organic like preserved tissue, and vaguely disturbing like formaldehyde that implied practices beyond normal frontier medicine or food preservation, hints of experimentation. As Brennan prepared to leave after his initial assessment, packing his stethoscope, Patrick pulled him aside with an urgency that bordered on desperation, gripping his arm with surprising strength. His manner suggested a man wrestling with competing desires to maintain family secrets and seek help for problems that had grown beyond his ability to manage alone, voice dropping to a whisper. "Doctor," Patrick said, glancing nervously toward the cabin to ensure they weren't overheard by family members, breath hot on Brennan's ear. "If I were to tell you that sometimes God tests families in ways that require terrible choices, would you understand what I mean? Would you be able to help without asking questions that might bring trouble to people who are already suffering from burdens passed down?" Before Brennan could formulate a response, Patrick continued with increasing agitation, words tumbling. "Our bloodline carries great strength, but it also carries complications, traits that manifest in the young. We've learned to manage these complications through methods that our fathers and grandfathers developed over many generations, methods tested in the old country's hardships. These methods have worked for us in Ireland, but here in Montana, people ask different kinds of questions. They expect things that we cannot provide without revealing practices that wouldn't be understood by those who don't share our particular burdens, our duty to the line." The implications of Patrick's carefully worded confession sent chills through Brennan's professional composure, his mind racing to eugenic theories he had studied. He was beginning to understand that the Donnelly family's isolation wasn't just about avoiding social scrutiny for unusual behavior. It was about hiding systematic practices that would horrify even the frontier's rough-and-tumble society. Practices that had been refined and perfected over multiple generations before being transplanted to the American wilderness, a transplant taking root in poisoned soil. 2 months after his initial visit, As summer heat baked the mountains and wild berries ripened, Dr. Brennan received an urgent message from Jake Harrison that would force him to confront the full horror of the Donnelly family's genetic legacy. The message, delivered by a local trapper who had risked the treacherous mountain trail on foot, his pelt bundle smelling of musk, contained only a few hastily scrawled words on crumpled paper. Donnelly, woman in bad labor, family asking for doctor. Something wrong beyond normal birthing troubles. Come quick if you can. For the first time since their arrival in Montana Territory, the Donnelly family was requesting outside medical assistance, a dramatic departure from their previous insistence on handling all family matters privately, suggesting complications so severe that even their extensive experience with difficult births couldn't provide adequate solutions, their self-reliance cracking. Brennan arrived at the mountain cabin on a sweltering July afternoon to find a scene that would haunt his nightmares for decades to come, sweat soaking his shirt as he dismounted. The oppressive heat had turned the isolated valley into a furnace, air shimmering over the ground, and the air hung thick with humidity that made breathing difficult even for healthy individuals, flies buzzing incessantly. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was even more stifling, heavy with the smells of sweat, blood, and something else, a sickly sweet odor that Brennan couldn't immediately identify, but that triggered his instincts as deeply wrong, like gangrene or decay. Moira Donnelly lay in the cabin's back room, her labor complicated by factors that became immediately apparent to Brennan's trained eye. The young woman was giving birth to twins, but these weren't ordinary multiple births. The infants were conjoined at the torso, fused skin and bone, and appeared to share major internal organs. A liver, perhaps a heart, a condition that Brennan knew was almost always fatal in an era before advanced surgical intervention, Siamese twins doomed by primitive tools. But what shocked him most wasn't the medical complexity of the situation, the tangled limbs and shared cries, but rather the family's reaction to this obviously catastrophic development. Rather than the panic, grief, and desperate hope for divine intervention that he expected from parents facing such a tragedy, tears, rosary beads clutched, the Donnellys displayed a cold, methodical response that suggested they had dealt with similar situations many times before, faces set in resignation. Patrick and Bridget worked together with the efficiency of people following a well-established protocol, their movements coordinated and purposeful rather than frantic, boiling water, preparing cloths, mixing herbal sedatives. Seamus and Colleen prepared materials and instruments that clearly weren't intended for celebrating a birth, but rather for managing a situation that required immediate and decisive action. Sharp knives, burial shrouds folded neatly. The twins themselves presented a medical challenge that would have strained the resources of even the best-equipped hospitals of the era, like those in Vienna, with their ether anesthesia and steel scalpels. They shared not only external tissue connections, but appeared to have integrated cardiovascular and nervous systems that made separation impossible, with 1876 medical technology, pulses syncing erratically. One infant was clearly stronger than the other, crying lustily, but both showed signs of vitality that suggested they might survive for days or even weeks if provided with appropriate supportive care, feeding through droppers, keeping warm. "Doctor," Patrick said with clinical detachment that chilled Brennan's blood wiping his brow, "we need you to tell us honestly whether they can be separated, whether there's any medical procedure that might allow one of them to survive as a normal child to carry on the line without weakness." As Brennan began his examination of the conjoined twins, probing gently with gloved hands, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath the birthing bed, in a dusty alcove, were leather-bound journals filled with detailed drawings and notes documenting similar births over what appeared to be many decades, pages yellowed with age. Page after page showed careful anatomical sketches of infants with various deformities, cleft palates, splitting faces, missing limbs, stubs, spinal malformations like twisted vines, extra digits branching like trees, and conditions that Brennan had never seen illustrated with such clinical precision, even in his European texts, like fused skulls or internal organ reversals. Each drawing was annotated with notes in Irish Gaelic and English, dated entries that spanned several decades and multiple geographic locations, from Cork farms in the 1790s to Pennsylvania in the 1850s. Some entries included detailed descriptions of remedial measures taken to address these genetic complications, using terminology that suggested medical knowledge far beyond what typical frontier families would possess, recessive expression purged, trait isolation through culling. The dates and locations of the documented births created a pattern that traced the family's movements across Ireland and America over more than 50 years, a migration map of horror. Most disturbing were the detailed anatomical studies that accompanied each birth record. The illustrations showed not just the external deformities, but also speculative internal anatomy based on postmortem examinations, potential survival prospects calculated like odds, and what the notes euphemistically called quality of life assessments, scoring systems for viability. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that these records documented systematic evaluation of newborn infants for traits that the family considered acceptable or unacceptable for survival, a breeding log for humans. Bridget noticed his discovery and spoke for the first time since his arrival, her voice carrying the weight of generations of terrible knowledge, hoarse from screaming and labor. "The bloodline must be kept pure, Doctor. Weakness cannot be allowed to spread and contaminate future generations. Our families learned this truth through hard experience over many generations back in the old country, through famines and wars that weeded the weak. What looks like cruelty to outsiders is actually mercy, both for the children who would suffer lives of pain and mockery, and for the family line that must be preserved strong." Her words were delivered with the conviction of someone reciting fundamental religious doctrine. Eyes fervent. But the doctrine she described involved principles of human breeding that violated every standard of medical ethics and human decency that Brennan had learned during his professional training, echoing his own disgraced ideas, but twisted into monstrosity. The Donnelly family wasn't just practicing infanticide. They were conducting systematic genetic experimentation on their own children, using principles of selective breeding that treated human beings as livestock to be improved through careful culling of undesirable traits, a farmyard eugenics. The leather journals contained additional evidence that revealed the true scope of the family's genetic manipulation. Hidden within the medical records were genealogical charts that traced the Donnelly bloodline through multiple generations, showing patterns of intermarriage between closely related family members that explain the high frequency of genetic abnormalities among their children, branches looping back on themselves like knots. The charts revealed that Patrick and Bridget weren't just husband and wife. They were also first cousins, continuing a pattern of deliberate inbreeding that extended back through 5 generations of carefully planned marriages designed to concentrate what the family believed were superior genetic traits: intelligence, beauty, resilience. The genealogical documentation showed that the practice had begun in Ireland during the early 1800s, when Patrick's great-grandfather Fergus had become convinced that the Irish people could be improved through selective breeding similar to the agricultural techniques used to develop superior livestock. Inspired by visits to English estates where prize bulls were bred for strength, the family had justified their systematic inbreeding through a twisted interpretation of biblical genealogies, Abraham and Sarah as half-siblings, and pseudo-scientific theories about racial superiority that had gained popularity among certain educated classes in Europe during that era, books like those on phrenology measuring skulls for intellect. As Brennan continued examining the twins and studying the family's medical records by candlelight, he realized he was witnessing the culmination of a genetic experiment that had been conducted across multiple generations with complete disregard for the suffering it caused, a century of hubris. The conjoined infants struggling for breath in their makeshift cradle, mewling weakly, represented not a random tragedy but the inevitable result of decades of systematic genetic manipulation that had finally produced abnormalities too severe to be hidden or rationalized away, the line collapsing under its own weight. As doctor, Brennan studied the hidden journals through the night, while the conjoined twins fought for their lives, pages turning under his fingers as the cabin creaked in the wind. The true scope of the Donnelly family's genetic manipulation became terrifyingly clear. The records documented not just 5 generations of selective breeding and systematic infanticide, but a comprehensive program of human experimentation that had been practiced with scientific precision for over a century, evolving from crude culling to detailed selection. The oldest entries, written in faded brown ink in archaic Irish script, described how the original Donnelly patriarch, Fergus Donnelly, had begun the practice in County Cork during the 1790s, after consulting with what the journal called learned men who understood the science of bloodlines and the improvement of human stock. perhaps traveling scholars or landlords, agents sharing breeding secrets. These early entries revealed that Fergus had been influenced by agricultural breeding theories that were becoming popular among progressive farmers of the era, men who had achieved remarkable success in developing superior breeds of cattle, horses, and sheep through careful selection and controlled mating, like the Leicester sheep with their heavy fleeces. Fergus had become convinced that the same principles could be applied to human reproduction to create what he termed a perfected Irish bloodline that would be superior in intelligence, physical strength, and moral character to the degraded peasant stock that he believed had been weakened by centuries of British oppression, poverty, and intermixing with lesser folk. His initial experiments involved arranging marriages between his own children and their first cousins, justified through careful study of biblical genealogies that seemed to support the practice of close intermarriage within family groups, citing Lot's daughters or the tribes of Israel. The early results had seemed to support Fergus's theories. The first generation of deliberately inbred children showed unusual intelligence, striking physical beauty with those angular features, and what the family interpreted as evidence of genetic superiority, early walkers, quick learners. But the records also revealed that even in the first generation, there had been births of severely deformed infants that were quietly eliminated through what the journal euphemistically called merciful release from earthly suffering. Methods detailed: exposure to cold, herbal poisons like hemlock tea. As the generations progressed, the genetic experimentation became increasingly systematic and scientifically sophisticated, each patriarch adding layers. Each subsequent patriarch had refined the breeding program, introducing new selection criteria, testing infants for reflexes, eye color consistency, and developing increasingly elaborate justifications for eliminating children who failed to meet the family's evolving standards of genetic acceptability, incorporating ideas from phrenology or early Darwinism smuggled in books. The journals contained detailed discussions of traits considered desirable: pale blue eyes for clarity of vision, angular facial features for noble bearing, unusual height for dominance, mathematical aptitude for superior mind, and traits that warranted immediate elimination: visible physical deformities like hair lips, mental retardation indicated by delayed responses, and what the family termed behavioral irregularities like excessive crying or fits. But the most disturbing revelation came when Brennan discovered a section of the journal dedicated to what was called the Enhancement Protocol, pages encrypted with simple ciphers. The entries describe systematic attempts to accelerate the concentration of desired traits through increasingly close breeding relationships, siblings to half-siblings, uncles to nieces. Patrick's generation represented the culmination of this process. He and Bridget were not just first cousins, but the products of 4 previous generations of deliberate inbreeding designed to maximize the expression of what the family considered superior genetic characteristics, a pyramid narrowing to a point. The protocol had achieved its intended results in some respects. The surviving Donnelly family members did indeed show remarkable intelligence. Patrick could quote Shakespeare and calculate interest rates mentally, striking physical uniformity and certain capabilities that set them apart from typical frontier families like endurance and cold. But the genetic costs had been catastrophic. The high frequency of severe birth defects documented in graphs, the obvious mental health problems affecting the older children like Seamus's stutter and the progressive deterioration of the parents, Bridget's tremors, Patrick's white hair, all indicated that the family's genetic experiment had reached a point of crisis that threatened their survival as a viable breeding population, inbreeding depression manifesting fully. My great-grandfather believed he was creating a superior race. Patrick confessed as Brennan confronted him with the evidence from the journals, sitting by the fire, face illuminated in flickering light. He studied the breeding methods used by the finest horse and cattle breeders in Ireland, men who had created animals of exceptional quality through careful selection and controlled mating, prize winners at fairs. He believed that the Irish people had been degraded by centuries of poverty and oppression, and that only through deliberate improvement of our bloodlines could we reclaim our rightful position as a superior people, free from the weaknesses imposed by tyrants. Patrick's voice carried a mixture of pride and growing doubt as he continued, hands wringing. For 4 generations, the method seemed to work. Our family produced children of exceptional intelligence and beauty, men and women who could have been leaders and innovators, if the world had been ready to recognize our superiority, if not for the secrecy required. But the cost? The cost has been terrible. So many children born wrong, twisted by the very purity we sought. So many who had to be released from lives that would have brought nothing but suffering to themselves and shame to the family line, diluting the strength. The genetic reality that Brennan understood from his advanced medical training painted a far different picture than the family's eugenic fantasies. The Donnelly bloodline hadn't been purified and improved through selective breeding. It had been systematically destroyed through the accumulation of recessive genetic traits that produced increasingly severe abnormalities with each generation, deleterious alleles doubling up. The children who survived to adulthood carried hidden genetic damage that would inevitably be expressed in their own offspring, creating a downward spiral of genetic deterioration that could only end in the complete extinction of the family line, a dead end. The conjoined twins struggling for breath in their makeshift cradle represented the ultimate failure of the Donnelly genetic experiment. 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding had not created superior human beings. It had produced increasingly severe deformities that could no longer be hidden, rationalized, or eliminated without arousing the suspicions of a society that was becoming less tolerant of isolated family practices that violated accepted moral and legal standards, the frontier civilizing. As Brennan watched Patrick and Bridget prepare to carry out what they clearly saw as another necessary elimination of genetically unacceptable offspring, sharpening a blade, mixing a sedative, he realized he was witnessing the culmination of America's first systematic experiment in human eugenics, an experiment that had been conducted in secret for over a century, leaving a trail of murdered infants and psychologically destroyed family members across 2 continents, a legacy of bones. The immediate confrontation over the fate of the conjoined twins became a battle not just for the lives of 2 suffering infants, but for the soul of a family that had lost all sense of human decency, in pursuit of genetic perfection that existed only in their own twisted imagination, ideals corrupted into nightmare. The confrontation between Dr. Brennan and the Donnelly family over the fate of the conjoined twins marked the end of their century-long genetic experiment, and the beginning of a reckoning that would expose one of the darkest chapters in the intersection of family secrets, primitive genetic science, and the American frontier's tolerance for isolated communities operating beyond the reach of civilized oversight. Brennan's intervention, backed by his authority as territorial physician and his explicit threat to involve federal marshals from Fort Benton if the family harmed the twins, "I'll ride for the law at dawn," forced the Donnellys to acknowledge that their isolated practices could no longer be sustained in an increasingly connected American society, where unusual infant mortality rates and suspicious family dynamics would inevitably attract official attention that could no longer be avoided through geographic isolation alone, telegraphs linking towns, railroads encroaching. The twins survived only 3 days despite Brennan's best efforts to provide supportive care with the primitive medical equipment available in the remote mountain cabin. Dropper feeds of goat's milk, wrapping in warm blankets, monitoring breaths with a stethoscope. Their shared cardiovascular system proved unable to sustain life, hearts faltering in unison, and they died quietly during the pre-dawn hours of Brennan's 3rd day at the homestead, tiny bodies going still as the first light crept over the ridges. But their brief existence served as the final undeniable proof of the devastating consequences of the Donnelly family's genetic manipulation, consequences that could no longer be hidden from the outside world, or rationalized through religious justifications that had become increasingly hollow with each generation of systematic inbreeding, faith twisted into excuse. The twins, death provided Brennan with the legal authority he needed to conduct a thorough investigation of the family's practices and medical history, citing public health risks. His examination of the 11 small graves behind the cabin, digging with a shovel under Patrick's defeated gaze, combined with detailed study of the family's medical journals and genealogical records, revealed evidence of systematic infanticide, spanning multiple generations and involving at least 23 documented cases of children who had been eliminated for various genetic defects, ranging from visible physical deformities like limb reductions to behavioral traits that the family found unacceptable, such as excessive sensitivity noted as weak. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of murder charges that could result in execution under territorial law, hanging in Helena's public square, Patrick Donnelly finally revealed the full extent of their family history and the systematic genetic experimentation that had consumed 5 generations of his lineage, breaking down in sobs by the fire. The practice had begun in Ireland during the early 1800s, when his great-grandfather Fergus had become obsessed with creating what he called a perfect Irish bloodline, through selective breeding techniques adapted from agricultural animal husbandry, dreaming of a clan that could rise above oppression. The family had justified their actions through a combination of pseudoscientific theories about human improvement, twisted religious interpretations that portrayed genetic defects as divine punishment for racial impurity, and social Darwinist philosophies that were gaining popularity among certain educated classes during the mid-19th century. Survival of the fittest applied to kin. They had convinced themselves that eliminating defective offspring was not murder, but rather a form of genetic stewardship that would eventually produce human beings superior to the degraded masses of common people, a chosen people remade. The psychological toll of maintaining these beliefs and practices across multiple generations had been catastrophic for every member of the family. Patrick himself suffered from chronic anxiety and depression that had worsened dramatically as the genetic consequences of inbreeding became impossible to ignore, nightmares of buried cries. Bridget had experienced multiple nervous breakdowns and showed signs of what Brennan recognized as severe post-traumatic stress resulting from years of participating in the systematic murder of her own children. The surviving children presented a tragic spectrum of psychological and physical damage resulting from both genetic factors and the traumatic environment in which they had been raised. Seamus, the eldest son, suffered a complete mental breakdown when questioned about his role in the family's practices, rocking and muttering, revealing that he had been forced to participate in the elimination of defective siblings from the age of 12, digging graves. His profound stutter and inability to maintain eye contact were symptoms of psychological trauma so severe that Brennan doubted he would ever recover sufficiently to function in normal society, perhaps in Moira and Colleen, both products of the family's systematic inbreeding, showed physical and psychological symptoms that would require years of treatment to address: hormonal imbalances, anxiety disorders. Both young women had been psychologically conditioned to accept their roles as breeding stock for continuing the family line, viewing incest as duty, and both showed signs of sexual abuse that suggested their father had been preparing them for marriages to their own brothers. The logical continuation of the family's genetic concentration program, cycles unbroken. Young Declan, whose physical deformities made him a living reminder of the family's genetic failures, presented the most complex challenge for territorial authorities. His spinal curvature and facial asymmetry were progressive conditions that would require ongoing medical treatment like braces, but his psychological state had been so severely damaged by witnessing years of infanticide and abuse that he posed potential dangers to himself and others, muttering threats. The boy disappeared one night from territorial custody in Helena, vanishing into the Montana wilderness without leaving any trace that would allow authorities to determine his fate. Perhaps suicide in a ravine, or survival as a hermit, his twisted form becoming legend among trappers. The legal proceedings against Patrick and Bridget Donnelly were complicated by the unprecedented nature of their crimes and the territorial justice system's lack of experience with cases involving systematic genetic experimentation and generational patterns of infanticide, no precedents in law books. The territorial prosecutors struggled to find appropriate charges for crimes that spanned multiple generations and jurisdictions: murder, conspiracy, even treason against nature, while defense attorneys attempted to argue that the defendants were victims of hereditary mental illness rather than calculating criminals who had systematically murdered their own children, insanity pleas based on inbreeding. The case attracted attention from medical and legal experts throughout the American territories, letters arriving from Chicago and San Francisco. But the remote location and primitive communication systems of the era meant that much of the evidence and testimony never reached the broader public, fading into obscurity. Patrick and Bridget Donnelly both died in territorial custody before their cases could come to trial. Patrick from what appeared to be a stroke brought on by the psychological stress of having his life's work exposed as a catastrophic failure, collapsing in his cell. Bridget from complications related to her final pregnancy, which ended in yet another severely malformed stillbirth that seemed to symbolize the ultimate futility of the family's genetic experimentation, her body giving out in labor. Dr. Brennan's detailed documentation of the case became part of early medical literature on the dangers of consanguineous marriage and the genetic consequences of systematic inbreeding. His reports published in territorial medical journals and later in national publications like the American Journal of the Medical Sciences, providing some of the first systematic evidence of the relationship between close family intermarriage and increased rates of genetic abnormalities in offspring, charts of defects. However, he never published the full details of what he had discovered, including the systematic infanticide and psychological abuse that had characterized the Donnelly family's practices, perhaps out of shame for his own past ideas. Brennan's private journals, discovered after his death in 1923 in a Helena attic, revealed his lifelong struggle to understand how human beings could systematically eliminate their own children in pursuit of genetic perfection that existed only in their own twisted imagination, pages filled with regrets. His notes described recurring nightmares about the conjoined twins, and persistent guilt about his inability to save the children who had been murdered before his intervention could protect them, wondering if earlier action could have broken the cycle. The Donnelly homestead was abandoned after the family's arrest, the cabin falling into disrepair as vines claimed the walls, and the mountain property reverted to territorial ownership when no surviving relatives could be located to claim inheritance rights, searches yielding no kin. Local residents avoided the area partly due to practical concerns about the harsh winter conditions that had made the location appealing to the family, avalanches, isolation, but also because of growing awareness of the horrors that had taken place there, rumors turning it into a haunted spot. The isolation that had once protected the family's secrets now served as a natural barrier that prevented curious visitors from disturbing what had become an unofficial monument to the dangers of genetic experimentation conducted without ethical oversight or scientific understanding, a cautionary ruin. The small cemetery behind the cabin, with its 11 documented graves and evidence of additional unmarked burial sites, bones unearthed by animals, served as a permanent reminder of the ultimate failure of humanity's first systematic experiment in genetic eugenics, silent witnesses. The neat rows of crosses, marking the graves of murdered infants, stood as testimony to the moral bankruptcy of theories that valued genetic purity over basic human decency and parental love, ideals perverted. In the decades following the exposure of the Donnelly family's practices, similar cases began to emerge in other isolated American communities, from Appalachian hollows to Oregon trails, suggesting that the Montana family had not been unique in their experimentation with human breeding techniques, whispers of other clans. The growing body of evidence about the genetic and psychological consequences of systematic inbreeding contributed to changing attitudes about marriage laws, child protection, and the need for government oversight of isolated communities that might be conducting practices harmful to their members or to society as a whole, leading to bans on cousin marriages in some states. The legacy of the Donnelly family's genetic experiment extended far beyond their own tragic story. Their case provided early evidence for genetic theories that would later become fundamental to modern understanding of heredity, like Mendel's laws rediscovered, while their systematic infanticide practices contributed to evolving legal and ethical standards for child protection that would eventually make such family-based eugenics programs impossible to sustain in American society, reforms in the progressive era. This mystery shows us how the pursuit of genetic perfection can lead to unthinkable horrors when combined with isolation, desperation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of human worth and scientific principle. The Donnelly family's century-long experiment in selective breeding represents one of the darkest chapters in the intersection of family secrets, primitive genetic science, and the American frontier's tolerance for communities that operated beyond the boundaries of civilized moral standards. Their story serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of treating human beings as experimental subjects in pursuit of theoretical improvements that exist only in the minds of those who have lost all sense of basic human decency and parental love.